Well, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming to our Climate Scientist panel today. I'm Lucinda Smith, the Environmental Services Department Director, and today we have three experts from CSU here to talk with staff about climate change science and its relevance in Fort Collins. I want to thank the Fort Collins Sustainability Group for organizing and inviting these three members to come, and I'd like to introduce our panel to you. First, we have Dr. Dennis Ojima, who's a professor in the Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department at CSU. He's also a senior research scientist with the Natural Resources Ecology Lab at CSU. And his research efforts have led to the creation of the North Central Climate Science Center, hosted for the Department of Interior at CSU. Next, we have Dr. Scott Denning, who's a professor in atmospheric science at CSU. He joined the CSU facility or faculty in 1998 and has served as director of the CMAC program since 2006. He does a lot of outreach about climate change science, speaking with audiences ranging from students to climate deniers. And we have Dr. LeRoy Poff with us as well. He's a professor of biology at CSU who teaches and trains and mentors graduate students in areas of aquatic and riparian ecosystems, and he's worked in areas ranging from Colorado to Australia and Ecuador. He's also the director of CSU's graduate degree program in ecology, and he has worked, among other things, on how science can be used to support sustainable management of streams in the face of competing water demands. So today we're going to have our panelists give a few brief introductory remarks, and then we'll have a good amount of time for staff to ask questions and have a dialogue with these experts. So I'd like to turn it over to them now, and thank you.
As you can tell, you were really blessed in our community to have such experts and such engaged city leaders and city staff. And I really applaud you for taking the initiative and really making the city the place that it is, and that attracts faculty to want to live here and work with the community. This past several years, I've been involved in a couple initiatives that are relevant to, I guess, the further discussion of looking at climate change impacts and looking at how do we actually look within a socio-ecological framing of these issues of how do we deal with those in community settings like this and in broader sort of across the region. And so those two activities is being involved with the Climate Science Center here on campus, which is a Department of Interior activity, which is really trying to distill the information that we know about climate change. And in fact, the recent report, and the reason I stood up this a little while ago, is that the recent National Climate Assessment Report was just rolled out Tuesday at the White House, and I had an opportunity of sitting in on that. And so these are the summary documents. The 600-page document is still in the press and will be out soon. But there's a lot of information here that we can share with you about what we do know about climate change, and it's quite a significant amount of information. And so the issue, though, is how do we actually deal with it now? And our Climate Science Center is about that. How do we work with decision makers and managers, especially in conservation areas, of how do we understand the changing environment that we're dealing with, the type of extreme events that we've seen locally in the fires and the droughts and the floods, how these might persist into the future, and how can we bring communities together and decision makers across various sectors to deal with these issues. And I think that latter part is really critical in how we actually look at how a city like Fort Collins, a county like Larimer County, that it's really looking at how we deal and adapt in a way that builds regional partnerships and looking at how communities can really learn from each other and that we're not isolated from our surrounding communities and the ecosystem processes and landscapes that we live in. And we really value, I think the other thing that's really valuable about our region and our state is that we have a community, a society that really values the ecosystem services and amenities that we have. Yet we're vulnerable because of the changes in our landscapes to really look at sort of how the changing landscapes, the infrastructures that we've created to get access to these systems in our mountains, in the valleys, and along the rivers, how they actually influence then the expression of climate change that affect our communities. And we see that in the floods and the fires over the last several years. So looking at, and I think what you're doing, and I really commend you on this, is looking at sort of the Fort Collins and its regional connections as a system, and a system of interconnected, ecosystem services, as a system of infrastructure that really links transportation, links the energy system that you have, and in the broader aspects of looking at our societal framework, looking at the livelihoods which our city depends upon economically, looking at the food, the water, the energy system, and looking at ways into the future of how we actually utilize the environmental context we're in, looking forward, envisioning the way that climate change may affect the delivery of the solar radiation, the changes in snow and precipitation, the seasonality of those changes that will influence our livelihoods that we depend upon within our region. How do we utilize that and look at how do we support those in an adaptive way that really incorporates the dynamic changes we're seeing in our weather patterns associated with the climate changes that we're dealing with. And I think as we look at that, the other thing that the city's done really well, and I commend you on this and hope we continue along this path of looking at renewable energy strategies that really deal with the climate that we do have with the wind and solar energy that is available, and really looking at this as a way of really looking in parallel how we simultaneously deal with the issues of emissions and emission reduction. That's really critical. How do we actually understand that under a changing climate scenario as well, and looking at the infrastructure that we build around the new energy resources that we have. And then also use that as a way of then bringing that across our city and actually through our mayor's efforts and the presidential task force, we extend that to other communities of similar size and sort of resources, and really sharing that locally. The last comment I'll make is that a new initiative that we're involved with at the university in partnership as a joint effort with CU Boulder is a new international initiative which builds upon the international city activities that you have been participating in. It's an initiative called Future Earth. And we're really excited about this opportunity. We're hoping that we'll actually have the secretariat, piece of the secretariat, the overall operational office here on campus and at CU Boulder's campus. And it's oriented toward looking at transformation toward sustainable development and transformations related to sustainable communities. So I think I feel really fortunate to be part of this community and to share what expertise I have on these various topics.
Okay, so let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit, I know that you're all familiar with climate change as an issue and as something that affects your work. I want to talk just step back from the local scale for a minute and just consider about what's driving this, where it's going, and what the challenge looks like from a science point of view. Of course, the big story is really that changes in the atmosphere have changed the rate at which the planet can get rid of heat. The heat comes in from the sun, and the CO2 gas in the atmosphere actually absorbs some of that as it's going out and slows down the rate at which the Earth can cool itself off. So heat accumulates in the Earth system. I see an awful lot of mistaken coverage, even recent article, front page New York Times, covering the IPCC rollout, basically mixing up the concept of emissions of CO2 with concentration of CO2. So the rate at which the CO2, at which the heat can get out is related to the concentration of CO2, not the emissions. The emissions is the rate of change of concentration. So, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere over time, and it's not chemically reactive. It's not an air pollutant in the way that some of you work with air pollutants. It doesn't react and turn into something else. It's done reacting by the time you get it to CO2. You work on emission controls on cars or whatever, the whole idea is to turn whatever it is into CO2. That's the end state. That's the unreactive thermodynamic end of the line. So once it's CO2 in the atmosphere, it's incredibly long-lived compared to other kinds of things that you think of as air pollutants. You can cut emissions, but that's not cutting CO2. That's not going to cool the climate. It's like a thermostat that only turns up, right? You juice the thermostat a little bit. It takes time for the heat to come on and to warm up the temperature, but even if we were to dramatically reduce our emissions of CO2, the thermostat doesn't go back down. It's a thermostat with a ratchet on it, which is really a kind of a scary metaphor for this sort of thing. The unmitigated pathway that has been considered both in the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC envisions turning the thermostat up quite a lot. By the end of this century, roughly the amount of warming, the amount of change in global temperatures that we saw at the end of the last ice age, when we went from ice sheets all the way down to New York City from the middle of Canada, took 10,000 years to warm up from that state, the sort of glacial maximum, to the interglacial. But we're talking about doing that 100 times that fast, 100 years instead of 10,000 years. That's probably a bad idea, right? If you warmed the climate that much, that fast, what you're basically doing is swapping out the climate of northern Colorado for something like the climate of southern New Mexico. Only in 10,000 years, that's enough time for the vegetation to sort of keep up, move along with the change. But if you changed it out in 100 years, sort of the climate of southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, there wouldn't be time for things. And so you see a switch from the ponderosa and lodgepole forest in our foothills, from the prairie that we have here, from the urban landscape that we have here, to something very different, but not gradually. And the way that happens is typically not a lot of fun to go through. And we've seen some of those changes in limited areas of our domain recently. You have large catastrophic events where you kill off one kind of vegetation and you have to wait for something else to come in. So not the kind of thing we really want to do. On the other hand, the air moves around. We don't have little walls separating the air of Fort Collins or Larimer County from the air of the rest of the world, and we don't get to set the CO2 concentration for the world here in the council chambers of the city of Fort Collins. Everywhere in the world has their hands on that thermostat, and so far lots of people have been moving to turn it up. So as Dennis pointed out, there's a need for resilience and there's a need for adaptation. And mitigation is a very, very important part of the goal to avoid that sort of ice age to interglacial kind of transition in 100 years. We don't want to do that. But unquestionably, there's going to be a need to do adaptation and resilience as well. And just think about even a low emissions future that pushes the thermostat up just a little rather than a whole lot is still likely to be quite a lot more warming in the future than we've seen in the past. We've only seen so far the CO2 at the Industrial Revolution was about 280 parts per million, and now it's 400, so about a 35% increase. The unmitigated future is for another 300% increase, so a vastly bigger increase in the 21st century than we saw in the 19th and 20th. But even a low emissions future is probably 50%, 100% increase over where pre-industrial. So there's going to be a substantial amount of warming. And maybe instead of looking at a sudden change of Larimer County climate to southern New Mexico, maybe you look at it as a sudden change from Larimer County climate to southern Colorado or northern New Mexico. Even still, that's quite a challenge when you're tasked with providing drinking water, irrigation water, dealing with stormwater, dealing with providing energy and providing urban infrastructure in especially under scenarios of rapid population growth. I mean, I know Fort Collins continues to be in the middle of a big population boom. I've lived here for 35 years. Population is more than doubled, close to tripled since I've lived here, and probably on track to do another 50% or something. Wow. Better you than me, right? Glad that you guys are on the ball dealing with this stuff. I looked at temperatures and snowpack data recently for our part of the mountains, and there's really very substantial changes already, even with this only 35% increase in the CO2. We notice dramatically much more rapid warming in the high country here in northern Colorado than globally, which I don't think is widely recognized, that the rate of warming in our high country is quite a bit faster than the rate of global warming. The snow melt is on the average moving earlier in the year by about 5 days per decade, has been for 30 years. You know, if you ever look at snow data, there's sort of a long season of accumulating snowpack from October to, April. And then there's a very short season, which we're just getting into now, where the snowpack all melts off. And if you move that back 5 days a decade, pretty soon you start encroaching on the accumulation part of the snowpack. And of course, that's when you start actually having less snowpack. You guys manage a bunch of water that comes out of reservoirs, but the biggest reservoir of all, for sure, for our part of the world, is the snowpack. You couldn't afford to build a reservoir that would hold as much water as all the water in our mountain snowpack. And when that starts being significantly impacted by a shorter accumulation season, we're really going to feel it down here. We're going to have to deal with a very substantial impact on water supply at the same time that we're dealing with a big impact on water demand with this big increase in population. I know you guys don't actually allocate water, but farmers own 85% of the water in this part of the world, and something's gonna give. I'm not sure exactly what, but I imagine that there will be a lot of discussion about what's going to give when the water is insufficient. So anyway, I think I'll stop. I know we need to have more of a conversation, but thanks.
Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I too am very encouraged by the progressive attitude that the city of Fort Collins is taking on issues of climate change mitigation and especially adaptation. I think, as Scott pointed out, there's a lot of momentum already in the atmosphere. Climate change is occurring. It will continue to accelerate for our lifetimes, at least. And Fort Collins is a very vulnerable city, particularly with respect to water supply. It's been reported in the paper several times, and I think that adaptation is a really key dimension of how the city goes forward in maintaining the quality of life in this city that attracts people and makes us all want to continue living here and working here. Most of my work has been in the area of sort of aquatic ecology and water sustainability from an ecological perspective. In the last couple of years, John Stokes could maybe maybe it's been 5 years, I can't exactly remember. I've been involved in the ecosystem response model process with the city of Fort Collins. That's been a very interesting and gratifying experience, and not challenging in many respects, about how we maintain a sustainable and healthy Poudre River into the future. And as an ecologist, I view part of our social well-being as having these amenities like a healthy river and aspects of our daily lives that are not always focused on livelihoods. That being said, I want to come at my comments today from sort of a water vulnerability perspective. That's sort of the area that I feel like I know more about, and I have some particular sort of specific three take-home points that I would like to put out there just for discussion that I think are going to be facing the city in terms of our adaptation policies, if you will, for the foreseeable future. Of course, climate change, one of the consistent predictions over many years has been increasing extremes, an increasing mean, but also the extremes the range of variability is increasing. And certainly we've seen that in the last few years with the 2011 snowpack, near record, 2012, basically near record on the low end, very dramatic shift, interannual shift. Of course, the 2013 floods, that occurred in September of all things. I want to sort of play off those events to frame these 3 points that I think are, they're not new, but I want to insert them into the conversation. So one is water quality. Okay, so clearly having suitable water quality in the city of Fort Collins, it became a big issue after the Hyde Park fire, right? And it's going to remain a huge issue into the future as the climate becomes drier and fires increase, and our imported water from the Poudre and Trans-Basin diversions are vulnerable to increased sediment and fine carbon runoff from fires. So I know the city's been thinking a lot about that, a lot, and a lot of new infrastructure has been built in sort of rapid response to decreased water quality from the Hyde Park fire. But another aspect of water quality is more sort of nutrient runoff control. I mean, lower water volumes in the summer, which are projected, combined with more people and poor, nutrient control means poor water quality. And we know we're starting to be faced with more stringent water regulations in terms of water quality regulations. So that's I think a big issue and something that we can sort of proactively address in the context of climate change. The second point is, I have 2 points on water quantity, one on sort of the low water end and the other on the high end. And so certainly from a water scarcity perspective, which we, for reasons that Scott was mentioning, may become the case, although we can't really, the climate models aren't very satisfying in terms of predicting what future precip is going to be. But certainly conservation is a key issue, and I don't know what the incentives are. I don't know how the federal government can help the city with incentives for water conservation. I know that's part of what the mayor's task force is looking for, and how can the federal government help? But that's, we discuss this all the time in the city, and in the 2002 drought, we effectively, conserved a lot more water than we're seeing. The per capita usage has gone back up, I think. So certainly water conservation is a key thing. The third point that I want to mention is water quantity on the high end, extreme high flows. Now, what I've learned through, and I'll focus here mainly on the Poudre River, because that's the the system that conveys most of the water through the city of Fort Collins, right? I mean, I think the city's done a reasonably good job on Spring Creek after the '97 floods to increase the storage capacity and sort of reduce risk of loss of life and property damage. But if we think about just the last several years, the 2011 runoff we were lucky, really, in that it didn't melt fast that year. And there were people at CSU, snow hydrologists, predicting that the runoff could reach 12 or 13,000 CFS through Fort Collins in 2011. Didn't really get above 3, it just lasted for a month, if you recall. So we were sort of lucky there. And then in this 2013 flood, which I don't know if that's a harbinger of climate change or not, but that was a pretty scary event. And I do research up in the mountains here with small streams, and some of those are just totally blown away by that event, particularly down further south. If that event had been 50 miles further north, the center of it, we saw 10,000 CFS coming through Fort Collins. I don't know what we would have seen, and that could have caused some real damage. I mean, we can pat ourselves on the back and say we did a great job, but we also we were spared what Longmont saw, for example, right? And there's no guarantee that that would happen next time around. So what I'd like to suggest is that, you know, we really need to rethink how we view the water cycle, and many of you have already done that, but you know, we're in this period of non-stationarity, right? There's no sort of repeatable statistical, there's no 100-year flood that you can really point to and say that's a 100-year flood. 100-year floods are now becoming 50-year floods. So we need to rethink what's our floodplain in Fort Collins, and how should we allow development on that floodplain that could be putting, you know, life and property at risk. I live on the north side of town, and I drive down LeMay a lot past Walmart, which I think was on the 100-year floodplain. They built a nice bridge to, they built some infrastructure in combination with that store that sort of mitigated, I suppose, the fact that they were encroaching on the floodplain. I'm a bit surprised to see Woodward Governor building on the old golf course, and I don't know, I mean, it looks like at least 2 feet of new ground has been put in there to effectively get them off the floodplain. I mean, I suppose it will consolidate and be geologically stable at some point, but in the near term, that's, you know, I wonder how effective and how much sort of citywide planning has gone into thinking about individual projects and how they affect the flood, you know, the floodway through the entire river corridor. And I know there's a lot of really good people working for the city, and these are, you know, open to a lot of discussion. I just want to say that from a citizen and from a scientific perspective, I would encourage there to be sort of system-wide thinking in how individual projects, you know, are vulnerable and how they contribute to risk at broader scales than just the place where it's being built. And I don't really have any technical information to provide there. I would say, I heard green infrastructure mentioned earlier. I think that's really a key to how we maintain how we reduce risk to life and property in Fort Collins along the Poudre River. And you know, that's something that in a way represents a new way of thinking. We've relied on, you know, hard infrastructure for a long time. A lot of that infrastructure was built under assumptions about how the climate would behave 50 years into the future. We can't make those assumptions anymore. We really need to build safety factors into our infrastructure through use of green infrastructure. And again, as a sort of a river ecologist type, I think this is sort of a win-win situation, because by using green infrastructure, reconnecting the river to its floodplain, allowing natural flood storage to occur, you know, then that also has a lot of ecosystem service benefits that the public also values, and we don't want to, you know, sort of lose those in the future as we go forward into climate change. So my final little closing comment would be that, you know, we really need to think about regional planning and sort of our vulnerability relative to other cities along the Front Range. How can we cooperate to build more robust and resilient, you know, water infrastructure delivery systems, and while not sort of reacting sort of frenetically in response to the latest crisis and end up sort of eroding our long-term amenities and, you know, the things that we value in our community. All right, so just one final point. We certainly need to take climate change into account in designing this new infrastructure, either as dynamic infrastructure or just projecting what the risk of failure is. And that hasn't been done very much. I know that in the draft EIS of the Glade Reservoir, there was really very little about climate change. And certainly the effectiveness of a reservoir of that type on the Poudre, the robustness of that could be very sensitive to climate change. And we really need to start, obviously, incorporating these risks into the way we think about our investments. So.
Great, thank you so much for those remarks, everyone. So now we have this great opportunity to have a dialogue. So who would like to start with a question for the panel?
So the question was related to how looking at local vulnerabilities and the actions taken at the local scale is embedded within the larger discussions about global environmental change and sort of the global dynamics of the climate system and things. So I think what you've asked is a very important question, and one aspect of it is that what you do at the local scale, especially dealing with vulnerabilities, is where really the action needs to be taken, because the nuance, the context of which local communities, the type of adaptive capacity, the type of regulations and infrastructure and technology that you have, and the knowledge sets that, the human resources you have, is applied and is sort of the pieces of the recipe that you have available to you to actually deal with both the challenges and opportunities that climate change represents. Lessons learned, I think that the type of community network that is developing around the world where, sister cities or these global network of resilient communities is a framework, a platform from which lessons learned elsewhere can be transmitted to other places, or lessons developed here can be exchanged within that global knowledge set, and I think there's value in that as well. And I think Fort Collins is doing that. The issue of I think feeling that you're not, that you're just the poor little Dutch boy with your finger in the dike, it really is changing in that there's a lot of fingers out there now, and they're all working together. And I think what a dialogue like this and engagement, especially through the university, we can make these connections so that lessons can be shared. The program that I mentioned, Future Earth, which is an international one that we're part of, is really one of its goals is to network communities, these local efforts within this global context. And even though what Scott and LeRoy mentioned about the global climate system it's a global climate system, we don't have as much control about that, but how it actually manifests itself at a local scale. The climate changes, the physics and the chemistry of the atmosphere, which we know very well, is something that expresses itself at a local scale, and the climate and the weather patterns, especially the weather patterns that we deal with, and those vagaries of extreme events because of a warmer climate, a warmer atmosphere, is what we need to include in our thinking and look at our vulnerabilities in the light of that changing dynamic. So I think I'm optimistic that we could build these communities of practice, in a better, more informed way.
Let me speak to it a little bit as well. I think it's maybe useful to think about mitigation of climate change versus adaptation to climate change. Or they're not against each other, but they're two different activities or two different objectives. And while it is true that at the local scale, we don't have the capability to provide energy for China and India that doesn't involve coal. We're not going to do that, right? We're just Fort Collins. Nevertheless, it is our responsibility to do the adaptation stuff that happens to our community. If we have floods and droughts and fires and various kinds of local impacts, by gosh, who else is gonna work on that adaptation? Just as we can't control emissions in Beijing, we can't wait for the Chinese government to bail out Fort Collins when it winds up under the gun from floods or droughts. The question was, what about energy? What about providing energy? What can we do at the regional scale to provide energy? There are alternatives. There's been some discussion of nuclear power as a way forward. I don't know that I've completely done justice to your question. Do you feel comfortable with that? Actually, I'm fairly optimistic about this. There's a huge need for energy, particularly, there's 7 billion people on the planet, only 1 billion of us use a lot of energy. Meaning that there are 6 billion people who use much, much less energy than we do. And a lot of students will sometimes talk to me and say, well, the real problem is population. No, actually, the real problem is that there are billions of really poor people who don't want to be poor anymore, and even if there aren't more people, there will be more people using energy in the future. But as it turns out, there's a wide range of choices for how we make energy, and probably the easiest low-hanging fruit in this domain is energy efficiency. There is a huge opportunity to provide a decent lifestyle, a decent level of comfort and consumption with much lower use of energy than we use now. For example, 50% of energy in the United States is used in buildings, and architects have taken a huge, made a huge push over the last 10 years. 8 major architecture firms have committed to designing no building that's not net zero energy by 2030. And these are the 8 architecture firms that account for something like 90% of commercial construction in the United States. Zero energy in buildings by 2030 is a remarkable target when that's half of our energy. The estimate is that alone will save something like $6 trillion over the next 20 years in terms of avoided energy expenses. So this is not necessarily a freeze-in-the-dark kind of solution. This is a win-win. The price of photovoltaic electricity, I should say the panels, the actual physical item, has fallen 99% since I was a kid. 99% reduction. 80% since 2008. 2008 doesn't seem like that long ago. The price of solar panels has fallen 80% since 2008. We've seen the incredible growth of wind power in the strip of states, the
windy states.
The windy states, the ones from North Dakota down to Texas. And certainly here too. I mean, there's actually reason for a lot of optimism, in my opinion. There's not a one silver bullet here, but it's a sort of broad range of choices between really the cheapest, the ones that have negative cost. I mean, my gosh, people ask, I drive a Prius and people say, well, how long does it take for that to pay for itself? People don't ask how long does it take leather seats to pay for themselves, right? How long does it take your nice stereo in your car to pay for itself? Those don't ever pay for themselves. But the idea that energy can pay for itself, my gosh, get right on that.
I'd like to add something to that, just from the perspective of sort of the water, energy, food nexus, and so going back to the theme of water. Water is a limiting resource for us here in Colorado generally. And we can import virtual water through solar panels and other.
Import virtual water. Tell them.
Well, water is required to generate the solar panels, and use a waste stream. And if it's not our local water, then it's somebody else's water, and so that's virtual water for us. There's an issue that I think we really need to think more about, which is water for energy development, and certainly for non-renewable energy development. So I think this is not it's becoming a point of discussion, but it's not very well quantified at the point. I think there's a lot of contention, a lot of uncertainty, but certainly using water for fracking or for other kind of oil shale development, on the West Slope, creates a waste stream that may, sort of takes water out of the usable category. And so, as we go forward thinking about how we allocate our scarce water resources, I think that's something we need to clearly think more about, particularly if we can just sort of develop non-nuclear but renewable energy resources.
So the question is really looking at the interconnection between water availability, its use in food production, and looking at sort of the western states and western communities, and given the large export of food that we produce, how much more local food capacity should we develop and utilize given the limitations to water? I think one of the things that we're looking at in sort of the agricultural areas and looking at issues of food security, that the food demand, as we have a growing population and the demand for different quality of food is going to ever increase and affect the demand for high quality food, both not only in the caloric content and the calories that we get, but also the protein that we get and other things that would be really important. But the issue, especially in the western states, of looking at water resources, and we use so much water for agriculture, especially the irrigated agriculture that we utilize, that really enhance our production across the West, is actually how to actually become much more efficient with our water use in those areas. So it touches on the number of issues that LeRoy had mentioned about water availability and water quantity. And as one of the things that is relatively certain within the climate projections, or at least much more consistent across them, is the warming climate trends. And so with warmer temperatures, we have even greater water loss. And so the water demands and water stress on agricultural production is going to even be more acute. So we have to look at agricultural practices that are much more water conservation oriented, that are more drought resistant. And so the technology is moving that way. How we actually develop that in a local community landscape, there have been sort of some interesting analyses of looking at the sort of cost in way of water use, fertilizer use, and just the cost of doing local gardens and for agriculture versus getting your strawberries from Mexico and other places. And actually the transportation calculation on some of that, in sort of looking at the environmental conditions of food produced in Latin America and other places and transported, or roses from Africa, those sorts of things. That they actually there is a benefit of growing food where food grows well, or products that grow well, and the bulk transportation cost, at least on the carbon side, doesn't seem to be as bad as one would initially think. So it's again comes back to a point that I made earlier about we need to look at food security, food systems in a systems context, looking at a broad suite of metrics and looking at what makes sense. I think for us in the West, though, it does come down to water use in our conservation or efficient utilization of water in producing these various products. And I think that's where it's going to really the denominator in how we look at things. And that fits into the energy question as well, because water and energy is really tightly coupled. And so as we look at our food systems, it's tied into energy as well. So there's a lot of issues of way of sustainability that are defined in sort of food, water, and energy, and so that's one of the key points is how do we produce food locally. Yeah, there's a lot of active research on looking at crop selection, looking at genetic engineering of crops so that they're drought resistant and pest resistant and things like that, and then looking at the climate windows. And if you look at your seed packs today and you had one from 20 years ago, they'll look very different about what grows here in town versus what grew here, what they would look at 20 years ago. So so those type of research is ongoing. It was interesting on NPR this morning where they talked about another feature that a changing climate or changing CO2 has on food production is that, and we've seen this in rangelands. Jack Morgan and other, Bill Parton and I did research here looking at elevated CO2 on pastures, and we see the same effect, that the protein content of that forage goes down. And so the new study that came out today, not only is the protein content going down, but your iron is going down. And so there's these effects because of, even though you're fertilizing with CO2 your crops, is the quality of that food product the same? And so there are changes that are taking place there. We're also seeing, what do we do with the soils? The soils are very important, and maintaining those in a way that recycles its nutrients, maintains the water holding capacity. And so looking at our food systems in a way that is healthy and not so chemically driven. So it comes back to looking at, how do we utilize ecosystem services, the biodiversity of the soils in a way that's really useful. I was just talking with Tom Lovejoy, who's a conservationist, a biodiversity expert, world renowned, and he was sort of also, quite concerned about the loss of biodiversity, and looking at that, the basic DNA structure that we depend upon, that we evolve from in the plants and animals that really our civilization is built upon, is being lost. And what Earth system history are we losing by seeing that biodiversity being lost and undermined at such a rapid rate? So a number of different dimensions. Looking at the food system, how do we manage it? How do we actually then, in an intelligent way, support genetic engineering in a way that's not harmful to native biodiversity? And so those are ethical questions that we haven't really come to grips with. We're just starting to learn what questions to ask about how we actually use technology, and we've seen failures of technology in the past. And so how do we actually then learn to be more prudent of how we engage with technology and implement technology to the benefit of society, but still enhance ecosystem services in a way that still benefits us? So these are big challenges that we're wrestling with, and these are good questions to ask.
Just sort of a little sidebar to that. You think about from the water side again, we can think about food and fiber. Cotton is one of the most water-intensive, crops in the world, and many of us are wearing, cotton goods right now. And it seems like with Colorado's recent change in attitude towards marijuana, that hemp would be actually a viable fiber crop. I mean, I've had hemp clothing in the past, and I find it really comfortable. And it's, now I guess I could wear it without being arrested, on the streets of Fort Collins. But that's something that actually grows very well in this climate, and maybe the city could, set up some experimental plots or something. Well, water, and so the question is, what can be done about water law in Colorado? I mean, it's a constitutional right. If you have water is defined as, you can maintain your right as long as you put water to beneficial use, which is defined as taking it out of the stream and putting on, on whatever, hemp. So, the University of Colorado Law School had, sort of fought this battle for years, and to try to change the Colorado Constitution to something that wasn't, prior appropriation. And that's a slow cultural change, I think, and, it could happen over time with shifting sort of demographics and, more stress. But frankly, I mean, from an aquatic ecosystem perspective, I'm very frustrated by that, because we can't keep water in the Poudre River, because it's not being used beneficially, so that water banks emerge and things like that, sort of creative end runs around the legal system that are politically sanctioned. One of the things that I've discovered, which I think is concerning in the context of water efficiency for crops, is that part of an individual irrigator's water right, if they're way downstream on a ditch, is actually the leaked water, the wasted water that comes from upstream users. And so there's really not an incentive, it turns out, for increasing water use efficiency upstream, because if you do that, then you're infringing on someone's downstream their expectations of what they've traditionally had in terms of water. So it's a very complex situation, of course. And I mean, the joke is that Colorado, and it's true actually, I've confirmed this several times, that Colorado has more water lawyers than all the other western states combined, because every transaction over water has to go through court, pretty much. It's not adjudicated as it is, say, in California. So that's, I think that's just a big constraint, that we work with, right? But the Colorado Water Conservation Board has, I think, with climate change, has become much more sort of engaged in how we think about, water conservation in agricultural systems as well. And it's too bad that Kristen Averett wasn't able to make it today, because she's the real expert on these things. And you want to take a shot at that?
I'd like to repeat the question and make a couple of comments before turning the microphone over. So, let me see if I can paraphrase that. There's a problem with watershed management or watershed protection, specifically very small jurisdictional control over different parts of the watershed between, say, city, state, Forest Service, et cetera. And there's a sense of imminent threat to resource from climate change. And there's a question about whether that's even true, and whether there's anything that can be done about shortening the time horizon of planning. Wow. So let me say something about the threat. I think it's important to understand. In a sense, this is the difference between weather and climate. We're often asked, all of us get questions like, well, what about that big flood last September? Was that climate change? And frankly, none of the individual events are climate change. The trouble is that the statistics of those events change. That's climate change, right? So whether you get a big fire this summer that takes out half your watershed or not, the threat really of climate change is that those kinds of events will happen more often. So it isn't the individual ones, it's the frequency of events, it's the severity of events, it's the overall statistics that change over time. I think there's good news and bad news here. The good news is those statistics actually, from an urban planning point of view, those statistics change rather slowly. The bad news is they're going to change a lot, right? The good news is that you're not going to fall off the end of the world tomorrow. The bad news is the end of the world is out. I mean, I'm exaggerating. It's not the end of the world. But the bad news is that the changes are really likely to be very profound over a period of decades. But it isn't like the whole world switches over, tomorrow. That's the interannual stuff that LeRoy was talking about. 2011 was a killer, huge snowpack. 2012 was really dry. 2014 is shaping up to be a big snowpack. I mean, it already is. It's a huge snowpack. That interannual variability is something that you've always had to plan for. What you have to plan for is that the statistics of that variability change in a systematic way, in a one-directional way, in a big way over time. I find it ironic that there's this jurisdictional concern, because you ask the pine beetles whether they respect jurisdiction. You ask the fires whether they respect jurisdiction. You ask the floods whether they respect jurisdiction. No way, right? The fire burns wherever the heck it's going to burn, up to the ridge line. It doesn't matter who owns it or who manages it. It's probably, in my opinion as a citizen, it's really important that these different jurisdictions are talking to each other and trying to plan together, because this is a significant change that will affect all those jurisdictions.
So following on that last point, Jill, I think the type of networking you build with your management partners is really critical, and it's sort of exactly what Scott was alluding to or indicating. And we've seen this work in a number of different regional management contexts, and developing the sort of the trust and working relationships with your colleagues is critical. One of the things that is working against it, especially in some of the agencies, the turnover of some of the, especially in the federal agencies, are much too rapid, in the sense that people are moved every 3 to 5 years. And even in our discussions with looking at the FEMA and the floods, where people who came in right after the floods, within 6 months they were gone, and so that legacy and that history, working relationship gets eroded away. So developing these long-term relationships is really important, and you have some really good partners here in the region but then developing something that's more longer-term vision of where some of the, mission goals can be developed. So many of the agencies are essentially putting out fires, whether it's, really short-term, fast response type actions. So in thinking about the institutional structure, is really looking at what are some of those larger questions of shared goals that can be developed to where this working group and working relationship can really kind of start looking at, what is the institutional relationships, what are the policy venues or mechanisms that can be used to enhance and strengthen the resilience to do that. Because and once you establish that and look at, sort of ways of looking at preparedness in that longer, more goal-oriented fashion, then there's tangible things to do. So it's one of those tricks of looking at, and I don't know, Terry Chapin has this diagram. He's an ecologist that a lot of us uses his conceptual models. He talks about these slow and fast variables in ecology. That's like looking at the water flow or a fire event that it affects carbon emissions or water flow really short term. But then the slow variables is that what's the forest structure, what's the fuel load, what's the landscape construction, how is the landscapes oriented, so that and those slow variables really control what emerges, what comes out of the fast variable. On the social dimensions, there's also slow and fast variables. It's your fire response, it's what's your flood response mechanisms, who do you talk to when you run out of water, who do you call, hey, how do you deal with those, who's calling you up in the middle of the night, and how do you respond to those? Those are the fast responses, right? And you have ways, mechanisms of dealing with those. In addition, though, there are these slow institutional connections. That's where the social networking comes in. The human resource base, capacity building, how you educate and communicate, and developing those mechanisms that really starts informing actions around climate change, because climate change is one of those slow variables that influences the fast responses of weather. And so it's looking at how do we interconnect and understand the trends in these slow variables, both in the social and ecological framing of things. Looking at then how do we actually articulate goals and questions related to these slow processes, and then start institutionally, what are the action items that actually make the education process, the type of landscape heterogeneity, so that we can manage fires, floods, and droughts in a way that is doesn't take an emergency response, that the natural system can help manage some of that in a way that it's constructive, because you manage toward those type of extreme events. So it's that theory, how do we put that theory of slow and fast responses in institutional constructions back into practice? And so those are things that I'd love to talk to you more about that if you're interested in seeing. We have a little working group that's actually looking at that sort of intersection. So.
I take that as a very, the question is, how do you give hope to 20 to 30-year-olds? I mean, but maybe the question is broader than that, because I sense that there's that you yearn for hope for yourself too. just a guess. I actually think that, yeah, for my job, I mean, I got a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I teach college students and stuff. But when I do public presentations on climate change, I always do my 3 S's: simple, serious, and solvable. This is my mantra about talking to the public about climate change. The simple part is, I did it here: energy in, energy out. You change either one of those, and you get a change in heat, change in temperature. The serious one is what we've mostly focused on here, but the solvable one is really important. I think that from an engineering point of view, it is certainly possible to deliver enough energy to the large population of people out there in the world that don't have enough energy without putting huge amounts of CO2 in the air. This is from an engineering point of view, this is a solved problem. This is not something that we have to have the Manhattan Project to invent new technology. Those technologies are already in hand. And I think people need to hear that. People need to hear that is actually a doable thing. From an economic point of view, it has been credibly estimated by, Nobel Prize winning economists that completely transitioning to a sustainable energy infrastructure for the whole world would cost something like 1% of GDP, 1% of the economy, which is almost directly comparable to what it cost to retrofit the world with indoor plumbing 100 years ago. So think about the cost of ripping up all the streets in London and New York and ripping out all the walls in the tenement apartment buildings and putting pipes and drains and toilets and showers and stuff into, a billion people's houses 100 years ago. Phenomenal expense, right? Totally worth it. Totally worth to have flush toilets. And not only that, they didn't go broke putting in the flush toilets. There were, for example, plumbers that did very well putting in flush toilets. So I think from an economic point of view, there's not any reason to be terribly afraid of doing this. So engineering is check, economics is check. Really the challenge is social and political. And that's a big challenge, I agree. But the number of people who will benefit from meeting that challenge is enormous. And the way I prefer to think about the developing world is that it's an opportunity for the developing world rather than a calamity. That visited China last year about this time and was couldn't see 5 blocks through the smog in Beijing, and just terrible. Billions of people living in very unpleasant circumstances. Those people desperately want to move to a better life, and the way that people move towards good stuff is one of the defining characteristics of the human being. I'm optimistic. I think that's the carrot side. The stick side is the climate change impacts will get worse and worse and worse and worse until people solve those social and political problems and stop making it get worse. So there's both a carrot and a stick, and I'm really quite optimistic that the kids are going to be okay.
Pass on. So the question is about, is the discussion around sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so why is that dialogue or discussion less heard today than it had, I guess, maybe 10 years ago? I guess in my sense, I haven't seen it drop off so much. I think what you've probably heard in this country a lot is, sort of the urgency, or at least the recognition that to deal with climate change, the response side is adaptation, which 10 years ago was not being talked about. So I think that's why you're perceiving a less of a discussion around sequestration. But the issue, to me, that the manner in which we actually withdraw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, sequestration is part of the deal. That the efficiency part is important, but we have, as Scott mentioned, a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere already embedded. That we're on track because of the embedded CO2 in the atmosphere, that we're going to see climate change emerging over the next century or more just with the CO2 that we have in the atmosphere now. So without active sequestration, both either in biological or geological mechanisms, then we are more urgently at risk if we don't take adaptation strategies seriously. So there is a lot of discussion still within the Department of Energy, looking at a variety of mechanisms, geologic and of biological sequestration. So I think it's just being, I guess, currently in this country masked by a recent recognition that, oh my gosh, we got to do something about adaptation.
So regarding sequestration, I want to speak a little bit to that too. The fundamental reason why there's a limit to the effectiveness of sequestration is that we dig up fixed carbon, organic carbon from the ground and set it on fire because we get something out of it, and that something is energy. And the reverse process actually consumes energy. So taking CO2 out of the air and capturing it and sticking it back in the ground consumes a vast amount of energy. So where are you going to get the energy to suck all the CO2 out of the air? Well, let's burn some coal, right? that would be a problem. So what you have to do really large amounts of carbon sequestration is an abundant source of carbon-free energy, which, if you had that, you wouldn't be putting the CO2 in the atmosphere in the first place. So the fundamental thermodynamics are against you with this. Now, there is sequestration that is considered both biosequestration, like growing trees. Okay, you see the bumper stickers, trees are the answer. The trouble there is, I jest. The trees have to not die, because you take CO2 and you put it into trees, but then when the trees die and they decompose, it goes back in the air. So there has to be, to have a long-term impact, you have to put it into very long lived forms, like wood that doesn't decompose very easily. So you may have seen this sort of benchmark called the wedges. I don't know if that's ring. You're not nodding, so it doesn't ring a bell. So here's a unit of measure. A wedge is a certain amount of carbon emissions reduction or sequestration. Doubling the gas mileage of all the cars in the world would be one wedge. Tripling the amount of nuclear power production in the world would be one wedge. Building biofuel, growing biofuel crops to displace gasoline over an area the size of the lower 48 in the United States would be one wedge. That's a scary amount of land, right? I mean, where are you going to find an area of land the size of the United States that's not already being used for something that you can commandeer to grow gasoline? This is fundamentally why this is hard. There is carbon capture and sequestration that's spun as clean coal technology, where you use about a third of the electricity from coal-fired power plant to capture the CO2 in the flue gas. So it's much easier to capture the CO2 if it's already 500,000 ppm in the smokestack than it is to do it when it's dispersed at 400 ppm. But even that uses about 1/3 of the electricity that's produced by the coal, and so the big ding on that is just that it's expensive. You spend $1 billion on your power plant, and then you use 1/3 of the electricity to capture the CO2. So these are all possibilities, but you need to sort of look at them on an even playing field with other technologies like solar and wind, which are actually much cheaper. So I'm sorry, I'm going to take this on a little bit.
No, I think you should.
And then pass it on. But so there's some interesting stuff here. Globally, first of all, you don't really want to just use climate model output to answer this question, in my opinion. So first off, when the world warms up, as the world warms up, without a doubt, there's more precipitation in the world. There has to be, because of warmer oceans evaporate more water. There's no way around this. However, the way precipitation is distributed around the world depends on the circulation of the atmosphere. So you have jungles in the tropics, and you got deserts in the subtropics, and then you got this sort of temperate zone where the forests are, where the jet stream lives, which is kind of where we live. And what all climate models, really pretty much every single climate model, shows that whole system kind of cranks harder under a warmer climate. There's more energy to turn the wheel. So you get wetter jungles, drier deserts, and wetter jet stream climates. Now, it turns out that Colorado, is right on the zero line, the crossing line between the drier desert and the wetter jet stream behavior. So if you're way the heck up in Canada, almost certainly you're going to have more rainfall. If you're down in Arizona, almost certainly you're going to have less rainfall. But somewhere right around here, you switch from we're reliably going to have less rainfall to we're reliably going to have more rainfall. And where that line happens to fall is I would say, not skillfully predicted. We don't know exactly where that's going to be. Now, that being said, for water here, we still can confidently predict that there will be a supply problem in Colorado. How can I do that? If I had just told you I can't tell whether precip's going to go up or go down, but warmer air evaporates more water. So for sure there's more evaporation, but not for sure there's more rainfall. And what you have to break even is for the precipitation to increase at least as much as the evaporation is for sure going to increase. So there's almost certainly going to be a supply problem here, even though I can't tell you whether the rainfall will go up or go down. The estimates for evapotranspiration or for evaporative demand here are on the order of 20% increase in evaporative demand depends on the scenario and how long in the future you want to look. There's also this business, to me, the important issue for you, for being a water manager here, is the snowpack. Because most of our water is stored for us for free without having to build a reservoir in a snowpack which is very, very vulnerable to small changes in the seasonality of temperature. So oddly, you frame the question as, if you can't tell me what's going to happen to the precip, how do I plan for water? You're right, I can't tell you what's going to happen to the precip, but strangely, I can tell you that you're going to have water shortages, even though I can't tell you about the precip. It's not, the impact here is not a precip-driven impact, it's an ET loss-driven impact, and it's a change in the seasonality of accumulation and melting of the snowpack, which is also an impact. The fire thing is even worse story than the water supply thing, and that has to do with earlier spring, which gives you longer season for evaporative loss. So that you transition from that wet spring soil into a dry late summer soil earlier in the season. You have more days of opportunity for a lightning strike and wind and so forth to fan the flames. So anyway, that's my...
No, I agree with everything you've mentioned, and I guess two other aspects of the climate system that provides a little bit of further research and understanding what's going to occur in the climate pattern. And please correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I'm not a climatologist or atmospheric scientist. But the recent opening of the Arctic Ocean is affecting the circulation patterns in the jet stream as well. And so this whole thing about the wandering Arctic vortex and things that was hitting the mainstream news releases, headlines, is something that will occur more frequently. We're not actually sure how that's going to manifest itself as it wanders around the northern hemisphere, because a couple of years ago it affected Europe with a really dramatic, cold spell. This year we got hit with phenomenal snow, at least in the Rockies. The other thing that seems to be emerging from for a warmer atmosphere is that the rainfall intensity tends to be increasing, and that's recent decades have been actually showing that, and it's part of the National Climate Assessment Report, how that actually is manifested here in around our region of Colorado. I'm not quite sure yet. And talking with Nolan Duskin, he wasn't quite sure that he was able to see that signature as much as other parts of the United States. But it is something that is just part of the physics of the atmosphere. The warmer atmosphere will hold moisture more.
Every degree of warming increases the amount of water the atmosphere can hold by 4%. So you get 5 degrees of warming, that's 20% more water vapor. If you have something that lifts the air, called a storm, and there's 20% more water in the air, you get more that falls out. I mean, that's really an almost no-brainer effect, that you don't need fancy computer models to predict that, and it's exactly what we see.
So the question Lucinda was asking is regarding the information gap and sort of level of monitoring observations that could be useful in informing both the research as well as decisions made related to managing for climate change. And it seems to me that getting a better set of observations related to seasonal changes in weather patterns, and it gets back to, yes, each weather event is not an indicator of the climate system, but it's that accumulation of observations of how rainfall is taking place, the change in some of the seasonality of events that are occurring locally and regionally, and collecting these in a way that can be used to inform things like our climate models, things like our hydrological models, informing our ecosystem models in a way that we can provide more specific information that would be useful for the city and for our county and sort of our region. I mean, the city of Fort Collins is blessed on one hand because you have a lot of academics, both from the university and federal and state level, but we're geographically challenged because we're at the cusp between the mountains and the plains, and that's a difficult, just the interface between where we are, for the jet stream questions or issues that Scott mentioned, but then just the geography and topography that we reside in makes it a very complex sort of domain. But these observations of what's happening with things like our precipitation patterns that would be really helpful. What's happening with our land use patterns in way of where are the parks that are driving the type of evaporative inputs into the atmosphere, looking at irrigated, non-irrigated crops, where they reside so that we can incorporate them more in a fine-scaled fashion, looking at sort of water diversions. How much water are we bringing over from the western slope? It's a trade secret, but how do we actually sort of get an estimate of that so that we know how much water we're importing, which isn't locally being deposited. So there's a number of areas that would be useful to look at in a way of how do we look at this, our geographic location, and then the social economic use of our natural capital in a way that would inform the research activities that we can do to provide more fine scale, more detailed information of what may be some of the climate implications under a warmer climate, under these different scenarios that would translate into statistics of weather patterns that would be useful to you.
Yeah, I guess I would add a little bit to that. I don't know how many monitoring gauges the city of Fort Collins actually deploys in our watershed. Or you have hydrologic gauging there as well?
Yeah, and some of those are USGS that we
Right.
enforce.
Certainly there's things that the city can do. I mean, the rain gauge reporting system is, like citizen science, and that's really tremendously helpful. It really allowed the mapping of this big September storm all across the Front Range. That was amazing. But there are things that the federal government really needs to do, and they've been, I think it would be really helpful for local communities to tell the federal government, we need to reinstall some of those non-working stream gauges up along the Front Range, in the mountains of the Front Range. No, that were discontinued because of budget cuts, in the 90s and 2000s, and some of it were undoubtedly blown out by the floods. But I mean, the broader point is that there's sort of shrinking federal support for, these kinds of monitoring systems that are integral to, knowing what's going on. And I recently read, I don't know this firsthand, but there was an effort to cut back on the snowtail gauges. That's we're really dependent on snowpack. That's not a really good idea, right? So, the federal government does have a role in providing information, and they have the infrastructure to do it. It's just a matter of political will and the resources, of course.
So I think the federal government's challenged at actually trying to engage at these local community levels. I mean, there's a number of examples, the owl situations in the Northwest, and, we're going to probably see quite a bit of concern emerge with the sage grouse listing as it comes forward. We're seeing that in the Gunnison now. So I think there's a reluctance, and probably a healthy reluctance of the federal government to just step in uninvited. So it really takes an initial level of community building, sort of what Jill was talking about, that to emerge to where a specific set of tasks can be articulated to the federal agencies to actually come in. I think without that invitation and that willingness and seeing an openness to actually partner, then they can use their really extensive expertise and skills and tools, but it has to be, I think, locally derived.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I agree with that sort of where the motivation comes from, but it seems like there is a lot of interest. There's a lot of common risks and vulnerabilities along the Front Range. And it would be, I think, really appropriate for the city of Fort Collins to partner with other cities and say to the federal government, you have all these resources and expertise. We need some kind of regional vulnerability analysis, that helps us better understand, where the risks are for different kinds of, vulnerabilities such as, water supply, fire. And I think that's an appropriate role for the federal government because of their expertise. And it's, but I agree, if it comes from the communities, then it's probably a lot more likely to happen.
I think that, you raise a very interesting point, and the question or comment is related to looking at the shift in governance structures from local to federal, and looking at the role that they play at dealing with these transboundary issues, whether it's energy, water, conservation, a number of things that we deal with as a society today. And I think there is a need to rethink of how we actually look at governance structures and try and find a way of enabling local decisions that are communicated and enabled by the federal system. Because in a number of ways, especially when you look at these broad issues of air quality, water transfers, energy production, they really transcend city and state boundaries in a way that regulation is really important. So there's equity, there's access, and so I think these are 21st century questions that we're working with 19th century institutions, and how do we actually look at what way do we change these things, and there's certain policies that may need fixing, but then it's also then being careful what you ask for as you start unraveling some of these policy and institutional frameworks, and try to see how what you might get and what the intended consequences might be. So these are, again, go back to my conceptual model of looking at these slow variables. In some senses, having them slow is actually good, so you don't have these political wills just kind of jerking things around willy-nilly. But then are there thoughtful ways of changing the institutional relationships so that they're not impediments to progress? And so how do we actually do that? And there are social scientists. Michelle Betzel, a good colleague of a number of ours, is looking at that. She's a political scientist. And as we look at things like climate change, and especially adaptation structures, there are a lot of policy impediments for how local communities and states and federal relationships work, and water is a good example of that. Fire management is another. these sorts of, sort of cross-jurisdictional issues. And so we are, a number of us are actually talking about the theoretical side of that. It's always eye-opening to talk to real decision-related managers and people about, what is it that is the real impediments? How do you break those down to create opportunities for interactions? And so, I'd be really interested in seeing, have you join our little discussion group on this at some point, just to provide some real world examples of where impediments exist and where they, how you got around them. There's some lessons there that we can learn from.
So the question was, can we use climate projection to understand the future potential for land use, productive farmland and so forth under a new climate, a different climate in the future? And I guess I'm going to wind up having to pass the baton here in a minute, because I think the answer is kind of no, that we don't really have like a map for where you're going to grow certain crops 50 years from now, 100 years from now. But let me say a couple of things about that. I think in some ways we are challenged by the diversity of climates here, but in some ways we're blessed, right? The fact, as Dennis said, we have all the way from the mountains to the plains, just here in Larimer County. It's like more than 1,000 miles north-south, right? All crammed into Larimer County because of the difference in climate between the Continental Divide and the Great Plains. There's this tremendous variety of climates here. And even after the climate changes and warms up, there will still be this tremendous elevation gradient, and so there'll be water gradients, and there'll be habitat gradients, and so forth. So I think that kind of cuts both ways. We have a lot to lose because we have this really cool transect of hot and dry all the way up to cold and wet within our little backyard. But we probably have opportunities for resilience that arise from that tremendous climate gradient that's right here in our backyard. I think the business about the jet stream meandering, that stuff is fundamentally more unpredictable than any of the other stuff that we've talked about. And I would actually kind of put a great big asterisk next to the stuff about whether or not the melting of the Arctic is actually causing the jet stream to behave differently than it used to behave. The jet stream's always been squirrely. I think it's a better, to project the future, think more like transport Fort Collins into Albuquerque. And, they've also got a topographic gradient. They grow different crops there than we grow. They still have urban infrastructure there. You can still imagine a future economic base, even if our climate transformed to Albuquerque. It'd be different, but it wouldn't be gone. And I think maybe that's a more useful analog than West Africa, anyway.
There are agricultural research groups that are actually looking at bioclimatic regions and how they're shifting. How useful they are still, sort of up in the air, because and how so I think the jury's still out about where crops are going to be grown under these new climate projections and what's going to happen. But there is some active research going on in that, and if you want to follow up, I could probably get you in touch or show you where the reports are coming out on that.
A planning horizon that's based on GCM output that's 50 years in the future is not that helpful to management. That's really more what are the sort of the short-term changes that are occurring and sort of adaptive, management over the decadal scale. And so we don't know what the climate of Fort Collins will. We're not going to plan for Albuquerque, tomorrow, right? We're going to be thinking what's going to happen over the next 10 years, what would cause our systems to fail, how do we design things so they don't fail over their lifetime. And so it's, we really have to be more dynamic in how we adapt because managers just don't do things 50 years out. At least I haven't seen that, except maybe in China.
Well, I would like to invite everyone to join me in thanking our panelists for a really great discussion